Let me open the session for today. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Honors College. We gather today to celebrate Constitution Day and Citizenship Day in fulfillment of the national mandate requiring that federally funded institutions of higher education host programs dedicated to the study of the United States Constitution. This commemoration serves as a reminder that every generation bears a responsibility to reflect upon and dedicate itself to the principles of the Constitution and to the duties of citizenship in a self-governing republic. Now, the official date for these celebrations is September 17th, the date in 1787 which marked the official conclusion of the work of the 55 delegates sent to the Philadelphia Convention to draft a federal constitution as a new framework for a Republican Union of the 13 independent states. In his role as president of the Constitutional Convention, George Washington signed the letter that transmitted the new proposed federal constitution to the Congress of the Confederation with the recommendation that the Congress submit it to the respective states for formal ratification. On September 18th, the day after the Constitutional Convention finished its work and adjourned, Benjamin Franklin, the senior statesman present, emerged from Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where he reportedly was met by Elizabeth Willing Powell, a lady of great social and political influence in Philadelphia. And with some urgency, she asked Dr. Franklin, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" To which Franklin replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." This Constitution, duly ratified, forged a republic, but its preamble implicitly acknowledged the need for continued reverence by and informed through the participation of the people themselves in order for that union to become more perfect over time. Citizens of the United States of America are thus called in each generation to reflect upon the principles of our national union and cultivate those civic virtues necessary to preserve and perpetuate our constitutional order, an obligation of citizenship which Abraham Lincoln foresaw in his Lyceum address. In this 1838 address, Lincoln gravely warned his fellow citizens of the dire threat posed to the nation by the political violence which accompanied the gradual erosion of respect for the rule of law and reverence for our constitutional order. The perpetuation of our political institutions, Lincoln argued, depended upon enlightened citizenship and reflective patriotism. For each generation must renew its devotion to constitutional self-government if the republic is indeed to endure. This task of preserving our republic has never been more urgent. America today faces a grave deficit in civic knowledge and civic literacy, a failing that undermines civic discourse and reasonable debate, a failing that, in addition, fuels ideological partisanship and encourages unreflective advocacy of extreme positions, and even contributes to the rise of unimaginable political violence. A recent comprehensive survey reveals that fewer than 1/3 of college students can identify James Madison as one of the authors of the U.S. Constitution. Only a small minority can identify which branch of government declares war or conducts an impeachment trial. Most do not know what exactly the 13th Amendment accomplished. Fewer still can identify who is the Speaker of the House or the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, these are not trivial matters, but basic civic knowledge that every citizen in our constitutional republic should possess. As Socrates himself argued long ago, virtue is knowledge and the basis for just action. The absence of civic knowledge weakens our capacity to deliberate together as citizens, to govern ourselves responsibly, to hold our leaders accountable, and to preserve constitutional government for future generations. To meet this challenge, our Constitution Day celebration this year also marks a new beginning for the Honors College in its academic mission, which will be devoted not only to the formation of lifelong learners through liberal education, but also of good citizens through civic education. The college's Lyceum Initiative takes up the task of cultivating good citizenship in order to perpetuate our political institutions in our own time. This initiative is dedicated to a renewal of civic education as part of the academic mission of the college and of the university, as inscribed in the university's founding charter. Our purpose is not partisan, but patriotic and civic, to prepare students for thoughtful citizenship in a constitutional republic by fostering the virtues of mind and of heart that sustain a free people. These virtues rest firmly upon civic knowledge as the foundation for engagement and leadership, as well as reasoned discourse and civil disagreement. In pursuing this purpose through the Lyceum Initiative, the Honors College joins a national movement in higher education dedicated to reclaiming civic learning and civic virtue as essential elements of liberal education and American citizenship. It is altogether fitting, then, that on this Constitution Day, with the start of the Lyceum Initiative, I'm able to introduce to you as well our first cohort of honors students dedicated to this task, who have been selected as Lyceum Fellows. Their academic work, research projects, and enthusiasm for the study of American constitutionalism and our founding documents embrace the goals of the Lyceum Initiative and will help us pursue its mission during this inaugural year. Will the Lyceum Fellows please rise? Thank you. So these Lyceum Fellows, these Lyceum Fellows represent the seriousness with which we here in the Honors College take up the challenge of perpetuating our political order through the Lyceum Initiative itself, which will look beyond a single year of programming to a longer-term strategic plan. The establishment here in our Honors College of a Center for Civic Thought and Leadership, which will join the effort already underway at public universities across the country to advance civic education. In this respect, we are fortunate to have with us today as our speaker for Constitution Day a scholar who has been a tireless advocate for establishing such centers of civic thought and leadership nationwide. So it's my privilege to introduce to you now Dr. Paul Carrese. Dr. Carrese was the founding director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, established in 2016 as the first department of its kind in the nation. Under his leadership, this school, known as SCETL, its acronym, grew rapidly into a thriving department offering undergraduate and graduate degrees, programs in civic discourse and civics, and national partnerships. He has guided its mission to restore the civic purpose of public higher education by combining the study of classic texts with American civic thought and constitutionalism. Prior to his work as the founding director of SCETL at ASU, he served for nearly 2 decades on the faculty of the United States Air Force Academy, where he co-founded its Great Books Honors Program. As a scholar, Dr. Carrese has been the center of a national movement to restore civic thought and leadership in higher education. In this respect, of course, he has worked tirelessly to help establish and create civic institutes and centers at public universities, working with faculty, administrators, and legislatures to ensure that civic education is restored as a core mission of higher learning. He's also collaborated with scholars across the political spectrum, from left to right, including, most especially, Danielle Allen of Harvard in their work with the Educating for American Democracy Project, a national effort to renew civic education for the rising generation. His published work as a scholar includes texts with titles like Democracy and Moderation, Montesquieu, Tocqueville, and Sustainable Liberalism, and The Cloaking of Power, Montesquieu, Blackstone, and the Rise of Judicial Activism, along with scores of essays on constitutionalism, liberal democracy, and civic education. He currently is serving also as a senior fellow for civic thought and leadership and as a member of the Academic Advisory Council of the Jack Miller Center, which has graciously sponsored this Constitution Day. The title of his lecture this afternoon, then, is Civic Education for Our Constitutional Order. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carrese.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those kind welcoming remarks. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here especially at an honors college in a university that has such a deep commitment to a liberal arts education as the foundation of a university education. I'm very grateful to be working with Professor Gish about the idea of expanding the Phronēsis minor and the new Lyceum Initiative to prepare a broader set of University of Houston students, hopefully, for a liberal arts and American civic education in blend. And that would ensure that Citizenship Day and Constitution Day are more widely recognized on the campus and in the Houston community. We do need to note that this event is happening just within a week of a dark moment for American politics, the most recent act of political violence, the assassination, let's be candid, of a prominent political figure. And for a university community, we should grapple with the reality that this kind of political violence happened on a university campus in the middle of what was clearly a political discussion, a political debate. So I'll suggest that universities generally need to confront this reality, that universities are failing generally in civic education, citizenship education, and that this failure is one cause of the increase in political discord and political violence that America is suffering through. With that sober note, I do want to return to a kind of celebratory moment. Congratulations, everyone. We have a Constitution. We should be grateful we have a Constitution, and we should celebrate Constitution Day and Citizenship Day. It's one of the days of the year I get to wear my We the People tie. And Professor Gish gave you the history of it. I'll add a little bit more that we should be grateful for Senator Robert Byrd, Democrat of West Virginia, in the year 2004, proposing the legislation to commemorate this day. And this was just a few short years after the 9/11/2001 terrorist attacks. So it fits with that resurgence of patriotism and common civic bonds after that crisis. But by 2004, cracks were returning, or cracks were showing in American civic culture, and I think that was a further motivation for Senator Byrd. There was a national discussion with which we're much more familiar now about a decline in basic civic knowledge of the sort Professor Gish mentioned, and of civic unity, and particularly awareness already then, 2 decades ago, of the decline, especially among younger generations. And that has only grown worse over the past 2 decades. In 2004, I was a civilian professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy. We referred to, those of us who had no prior military service referred to ourselves as Athenians in Sparta. And I'd been basically hired to teach higher order American civics to future Air Force officers, preparing informed officer citizens for leadership in the military and beyond. And I was tasked by the dean in 2005 to organize the inaugural Constitution Day lecture for the Air Force Academy. Because the dean was also a brigadier general, I said, yes, ma'am, I'll organize that right away. I had begun teaching at the Air Force Academy just a few years before the 2001 terrorist attacks, and I was delighted to learn in detail that the 3 major service academies, Army, Navy, and Marines in Annapolis, and Air Force in Colorado, all 3 had a very strong commitment to a required curriculum of liberal arts learning as the foundation for the more detailed study that they might undertake, and especially at the Air Force Academy, many of them are engineering, STEM majors. And that's what I brought to Arizona State University in 2016 when I was asked to be the founding director of a new department on civic thought and leadership, this blend of American civic education with a liberal arts education foundation. So that's my theme today, that in order to be competent and committed citizens of the American Democratic Republic, we must do a better job of studying in K-12 schools and in higher education our American political history and the fundamental civic principles, ideals, and debates of our constitutional order. And further, my second point, we must study and begin to practice from elementary schooling through higher learning civic virtues. As adults, we must continue that kind of learning and be committed to both civic knowledge and civic virtues. Why? Because the U.S. Constitution presupposes or requires civic knowledge and several civic virtues among citizens widely and especially among office holders. The difficulty is that the Constitution doesn't explicitly state this and doesn't specify the civic knowledge and the civic virtues. And if we extend our constitutional founding from 1787 to 1791 with the ratification of the Bill of Rights, we can see even further what the challenge is. The civic virtues become all the more obvious as an issue. The First Amendment, for example, protects a right of free speech, also of religious liberty. Both of those presuppose a pluralism of ideas, of views, of philosophies about politics, about religion. For such pluralism to work so that we have a diversity of views, but not a disintegration of a civic order across a large federal republic, even to the point of descending into violence, we must have, again, in both everyday citizens as well as leaders in government and public life, several virtues, higher, nobler, difficult dispositions, in order to constructively handle this degree of diversity and pluralism. As I've been mentioning, I think it's painfully obvious today as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2026 that a great many Americans don't have, indeed they've never even heard of, this idea of civic knowledge and especially civic virtues. So a second point about our Constitution and Bill of Rights is that while civic virtues are needed among the citizenry that's expected to self-govern under such a complex political order, the Constitution not only doesn't mention civic education and civic virtues, it doesn't empower the federal government to undertake such civic education, to sustain the constitutional order itself. The one exception is professional military education, and that's fairly narrowly possible on a national security rationale. So America's challenge is that our national motto of E pluribus unum applies not just to the 13 republics and later states that come together to forge the federal union, it also applies to the pluralism among our American citizenry itself. Across 3 centuries, we've become the most ethnically, religiously, philosophically diverse republic in all of history. How will we meet the aim in the Constitution's preamble to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity if we don't have some minimal degree of common education in what those words mean, if we don't have some parameters or boundaries to the disagreements that we can constructively entertain about how to live up to our founding ideals? And boundaries certainly, therefore, to the modes and means of our political discourse. The most recent episode of political violence in America prods us to recognize a clear trend toward political violence, attempted murders in recent years against leading figures of both political parties. And of course, violent language and violence itself comes from both the right and the left side of the political spectrum today. It's regrettable but true that ignorant political discourse has long been routine in American politics, but now demonizing and political violence are becoming routine. Whether or not the digital age and social media are exacerbating these problems, educators need to improve our response. So as educators, as future leading citizens, and all concerned citizens of whatever political views, our challenge is twofold: to reprioritize civic knowledge and civic virtues. That means first, fundamental required civic education in American historical, constitutional, and civic knowledge from K through 16. And then related to this, to reprioritize education in experience of several civic virtues. The 3 most important are civil disagreement, civic friendship across divergent political and philosophical views, and a reflective patriotism. Arguably the root civic virtue combining gratitude for our country with a disposition to argue about and question our distinctive American political order. And that makes sense because our political order rests on ideas and ideals about justice. I should say a bit more about the alarming state of American civic knowledge, although Professor Gish warmed us up with that, which again I think is leading to this moment of a disintegrating civic order and civic crisis. And I need to say this because I've offered something of a provocation, especially to the few professors who are in the room, that professors should care about civic education or even about patriotism. To our ears today in the modern academy, this does not sound right. Evidence of our angry polarization and our civic decay is abundant. America is suffering a long-running decline in public confidence about most institutions and most professions. All national professions except for the military are consistently underwater, so to speak. And higher education, as well as K-12 public education, are in that group. Loss of confidence, legitimacy in the public at large. Further, as Professor Gish mentioned, the surveys and the statistics measuring widespread deficits of civic knowledge have continued to deliver bad news for many decades now. I'll mention one that he didn't mention. The U.S. Department of Education runs something called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, America's report card. And they have run for many decades now tests, sort of randomly sampled 8th graders in U.S. history and U.S. civics. The most recent scores were reported for 2022. Steady downward decline continued. In 2022, 8th graders across the country, only 22% of the 8th graders reached a basic proficiency in U.S. civics. Only 13% reached a basic proficiency in U.S. history. Such civic ignorance fuels, I think, the two extremes dominating our current civic decline. At the one extreme, the rising appetite for demagoguery and for political violence on both the left and the right. At the other extreme, and we pay less attention to this, a substantial civic apathy among many Americans. That seeds the civic sphere to the polarized combatants. Multiple recent surveys indicate that while a great majority of older Americans find it essential to live in a democracy or are proud of being American, positive responses to those kinds of questions plummet among Americans under 30. So America itself is underwater with younger generations. We should recall a poll from the spring of 2022, shortly after Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, asking Americans if they would stand and fight if invaded, as it was clear the Ukrainians were standing and fighting. For the under 35 group, 18 to 35, a majority replied no. America was not worth it, in effect. They would flee or surrender. Gallup has more recently reported in 2005 a continued decline in the top tier of levels of patriotism among all age groups, far below the level registered in 2000 before the 9/11 attacks, when there's a bit of an upsurge of patriotism. So for the 2025 figures, only 41% of adults are extremely proud to be American, then only 17% very proud, the level below that. That makes for 58% strongly patriotic. But again, for the younger cohorts, a problem, deeper problem. For the 18-34 age group, a large majority is not strongly patriotic. Only 24% registering they're extremely proud to be American, only 12%, the next notch down, very proud. What are the causes of this? Well, I'm a professor. I've been in higher education for 30 years. I'm going to look first inward. I do think higher education has a role. The relevant disciplines, especially my own, political science, but also history, we no longer encourage civic spirit. I think we do that on the premise that teaching or promoting any kind of public spirit, civic spirit, is jingoistic. It's unacademic. The dominant view in the academy apparently is that patriotism is a private choice at best for students. And then further, the foundations of anything like patriotism, that belongs in the K-12 schools. It's not our business. To the extent that there is something like civic education still remaining in our colleges and universities, it's been democracy education for many decades, promoting civic engagement, civic participation. But that is not the same as an American civic education for our constitutional democratic republic in civic knowledge and civic virtues. And I think the difference between these two approaches shows, producing the civic crisis that we have. Indeed, I'll put forward the provocative idea that a democracy education approach, civic engagement approach, may be provoking our political polarization. We should ask whether it's only a correlation or is there some causation that this amazing deficit of civic knowledge among younger Americans sits beside the support among younger Americans for using violence to shut down speech that you consider hateful or offensive. Recent polling by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, has shown that's clearly the case among a cohort of younger Americans. The academic neglect of, even the undermining of, an American patriotism and of the civic virtues of civil disagreement and civic friendship fits with the strong correlation of the last 75 years between declining status of civics in K-12 schools on the one hand, and on the other hand, the near disappearance of required civics in higher education, until a recent revival. Here I should emphasize that, as Dustin mentioned, I was part of a national study of K-12 civics and history education, released in 2021. Educating for American Democracy was the title. But I was the only academic conservative in the lead author group of 7 of us. But we used these concepts and these words. Civic knowledge first, along with civic virtues, and we emphasized the 3 civic virtues that I've mentioned to you here. The most prominent scholars of the group, as Dustin mentioned, Danielle Allen of Harvard, also Jane Kamensky, a historian at Harvard, and Peter Levine of Tufts University. Jane has since become so interested and committed to civic education that she took emeritus status. She retired as a history professor at Harvard. She's only my age, to become the president of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello, so she can more extensively and focally work on civic education. That EAD report also urges higher education to do its part to rebuild the entire K-16 ecosystem of civics, to supply not just well-prepared school teachers, but to prepare a broader citizenry shaped by required, rigorous American history and civic education for all graduates in civic knowledge and civic virtues. And again, the EAD report, we strongly encourage these 3 civic virtues I prioritized: civil disagreement, civic friendship across divergent views, and a reflective patriotism. Before turning to address in a bit more detail why the Constitution calls implicitly for a civic education in both knowledge and virtues, I should note that during the same period that we were hashing out the EAD report, arguing with each other, 2019 to 2021, 2 prominent leaders in American higher education independently confirmed this need to reprioritize civic education. First is Derek Bok, former president of Harvard University, in his 2020 book, Higher Expectations: Can Colleges Teach Students What They Need to Know in the 21st Century? And the second is Ronald Daniels, still the president of Johns Hopkins University, in his 2021 book, What Universities Owe Democracy. For President Daniels, the answer of the implicit question, what we owe, is a required civic education in core knowledge and then in civic virtues. That's the least higher education owes to a republic that provides educators so much prosperity, so much freedom, so much prominence. And President Daniels is exactly right. I don't think we can look around and see angry polarization, rising political violence, tolerance of political violence on the one extreme, and again on the other extreme, rising civic apathy and ignorance, and then say it's not our problem in higher education. I do think we professors are partly to blame. So what should we do? The period of America 250 is now beginning to celebrate and commemorate the American founding from the Declaration of Independence in 1776 in my view, at least through the ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791. That means opportunities for commemoration and education and discussion and debate from 2026 to at least 2041. A250, as it's called, gives us therefore a further reason to rediscover the civic education challenge set for us by the 1787 Constitution and its early amendments, let alone the further challenge that arises from the greater emphasis on equality in the Civil War amendments. Simply put, our very complex constitutional forms of separation of powers and federalism implicitly call for civil disagreement about both long-term and daily political issues, given this very structure, because the structure promotes argument within and across separate institutions. Separation of powers and federalism thus also call for civic friendship among Americans across the pluralism of partisan, religious, and philosophical views that the very system accommodates. These civic virtues must be paired with civic knowledge about the complex system itself, about why it's so complicated, how best to use it to achieve the aims of equal rights and liberty for all set out in the Declaration of Independence. Civil disagreement and civic friendship are challenging. That's why in the terminology we used in the EAD report, these are not just civic skills or civic dispositions, they are virtues. To hear out people with whom you disagree on policy issues, even on more fundamental issues, to share a basic civic bond and regard for Americans of different first principles or party views, that is hard. Why do it? As we would say today, it's easier to shut our ears, to speak louder, or to tweet and post more outrageously, to demonize those hateful, evil, un-American people who disagree with my tribe and my party and my point of view. And this raises the question again, why have these complex constitutional forms of separated powers of federalism that promote so much space for, so much opportunity for pluralism, argument, disagreement? Why set up a system which requires for it to function the need for compromise, consensus, if any major laws, any policies are to be peacefully achieved? I think a beginning premise for a renewal of a higher American civics, a premise clearly shared by the Phronēsis minor, by the new Lyceum Initiative here at University of Houston. The premise is that the framers of our constitutional order understood the strengths and weaknesses of human nature. They understood the challenges of liberty and of equal political rights better than our current trends in political science and history do. It's a rebuttable premise, but it should be our first premise. Our framers knew that free people always disagree, and that the more democratic or egalitarian a political order is, the more likely it is to descend into faction, tribalism, demagoguery, then violence and disorder, even disintegration. The separation of powers in the federal government, the distribution of powers between the state and federal governments, along with the First Amendment, protections of speech, other modes of civic discourse, they all presuppose a citizenry that will constantly disagree and argue, yet maintain a civic order. So how should we proceed in 2025 when most of higher education has either rejected or forgotten these foundations for an adequate civic education for America's constitutional order? Well, again, fortunately, we're at University of Houston in the Honors College, which has a commitment. It stands apart from these recent trends, a commitment to treasuring a serious liberal arts foundation for university learning, and for supporting a rich education in civic knowledge and civic virtues offered by the Phronēsis minor, now the new Lyceum Initiative. I hope there's support from the university leadership, from more public governing authorities of higher education in Texas, to expand the reach of these crucially important efforts. This difficult moment in American civic life should be the moment when educational and civic leaders regain our bearings and clarify first principles. In a forthcoming book entitled Teaching America, Reflective Patriotism in Schools, College, and Culture, I discuss the remarkable fact that several of America's leading founders wrote regularly about the importance of educating the citizenry of the new republic. They specifically mention both civic knowledge and civic virtues. Jefferson and Franklin and Adams and Madison, these were institution builders, statesmen, but they also devoted much attention and energy to improving education. Indeed, the foremost champion of a national university with a civic education mission is the founding father himself, the man of action, George Washington. He advocates for a national university in his first and last annual messages, what we now call the State of the Union Address. He also specifically mentions it in his extraordinary 1796 farewell address. In that extraordinary address, the great founder and statesman emphasizes this as one of his parting counsels to his fellow citizens. Our current civic decay, even civic disintegration, our poor state of civic knowledge, calls for places like the Honors College at University of Houston to step up, to expand its presence, to help the rest of the university, to help the rest of higher education in Texas, to recover the wisdom of America's founding statesmen. That the new constitutional order would not survive long, it certainly would not flourish and succeed without a focal commitment to a blend of liberal arts education and citizenship education to prepare each new generation of citizens and leaders. This is the Constitution Day period. Earlier this week, I was at University of Virginia to deliver a Constitution Day lecture there. Of course, I discussed the founding curriculum and mission for that university provided by none other than Thomas Jefferson and James Madison after they'd each been president of the United States. It was in 1818 in their Rockfish Gap report for the university commissioners. They proposed required study of rhetoric, political economy, natural law, government, and ethics, in addition to other subjects. And the larger civic aims of this new public university included the following: to form the statesmen, legislators, and judges on whom public prosperity and individual happiness are so much to depend. And I'll add that Jefferson and Madison were even more specific when it came to the required study of government. They specified 6 texts, including the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist, and Washington's farewell address. I do have to say, on the theme of civic friendship, I'm at University of Virginia. I'm really a Hamiltonian, but I'm saying all these nice things about Jefferson and Madison. And then I went up to Monticello to visit my friend Jane Kamensky. But I will share with you this secret, that when I went to the gift shop, wonderful display of books at Monticello, and all the little things you can purchase, the one thing that I purchased, Alexander Hamilton socks. Don't tell Jane. I've just learned from Professor Gish that the founding charter of the University of Houston from 1945, right, includes explicit language about preparing students for citizenship and civic education as a main mission for this institution. This gives the University of Houston further incentive to undertake what all of American higher education now needs. We need to discuss, debate, faculty and institutional leaders, what kinds of required coursework, what kinds of required experiences, what kinds of readings and debate and learning will meet this spirit of a blended liberal education and American civic education that is necessary for preparing and motivating informed citizens. Given the levels of civic ignorance and apathy among so many Americans, and especially younger generations, my suggestion is that educators must weave into this package motivation to study civics at all levels, perhaps especially in higher education. So again, with my co-authors in the EAD study of K-12 civics, we agreed from the more liberal center-left to the more conservative among us that a reflective patriotism is a crucial dimension of American civics. I go further in this forthcoming book, Teaching America, to argue it is the root civic virtue because it motivates us to learn and to practice the other civic virtues, civil disagreement, civic friendship, and there are others. It also motivates us to undertake study of civic knowledge in the first place. We should note that such a considered discursive patriotism also is not something mythological within the lifetime of the older folks in this room, we knew many American citizens, everyday citizens and leading Americans, who could combine love of and gratitude for country with a disposition to reasonably argue about, and question our distinctive American political order. Again, the questioning, the disagreement, the argument, they arise naturally because our distinctive character is to be a polity resting on ideas and ideals about justice. So I propose that only if we are attached to and grateful for our American constitutional order will we put in the hard work to learn and to disagree constructively and to maintain civic bonds across deep differences. Since you are founded on a liberal arts education, great works, the classic source for understanding America's reflective considered patriotism is Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, published in 2 volumes in 1835 and 1840, after he'd visited America. It's striking, though, that contemporaneously a young Abraham Lincoln in 1838 formulates a very similar view, as Professor Gish summarized, so I won't summarize it here. The address at the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois, under the formal title, On the Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions. I will go a little bit further beyond Professor Gish's summary to say that if we can't stop the descent into political violence, we are facing the prospect of dying by suicide. He explicitly says that. America will never be conquered by a foreign power, but we might die by suicide. He says this 2 decades before a horrible civil war. But again, note his remedy, as Professor Gish mentioned, a recommitment to civic education, including a rational, constitutionally informed patriotism. He does close the address, though, by speaking to the heart as well as the head. He says, if we can do this, if we can recover, the great George Washington will look down on us with pride from heaven. And he says we will then also be worthy of the only other greater institution beyond the American Republic, the Christian church. So in 1838, there's something of the blend of his first inaugural address in 1861. After his constitutional arguments, he closes by an appeal to the mystic chords of memory that might unite us as Americans and to the better angels of our nature. And we might also think about why, by the second inaugural, he's entirely focused on the heart, in effect. Biblical faith and a civic virtue needed to heal a shattered nation. Though neither Tocqueville nor Lincoln knew of the other, their analyses and prescriptions about American civic virtue strongly align. Tocqueville, our French visitor, notes that the old world patriotism, from which he comes, is only of the heart. It's only sentimental, for blood and soil, for mythic history. But in contrast, he notes the pragmatic American spirit. Yes, it does love America, but it also moves from knowledge of founding ideals about natural rights of individuals to realizing that it's in one's self-interest to be civic-minded. It's only if one participates in a healthy civic order that you'll gain the advantages and the benefits for one's own family, one's friends, one's community. Later in Democracy in America, he calls the American pragmatism about civic virtue and participation an enlightened self-interest. He notes that Americans claim only to act on rational, self-interested grounds when they undertake civic duties and participation in civic life. But in fact, he says, they still undertake disinterested and unreflective acts of altruistic, magnanimous conduct. So here we see the same blend as with Lincoln. The full picture is that Americans, as citizens and being patriotic, blend the head and the heart. Rational argument, self-interest, with love of country and altruistic commitment to duty. In our own era, these kinds of arguments about the complex elements of a healthy civic culture have been pursued by Robert Putnam, not just in his book from a quarter century ago, Bowling Alone, but in the sequel to that work with Notre Dame professor David Campbell called American Grace, about the importance of, but decline in, our civic capital, as they call it, intertwined with our religious culture. So educators today who agree with me on the basic need for improved and reprioritized civic education, but who have tended to focus on democracy education, civic engagement, they should consider the full complexity of what Tocqueville sees as a healthy, reflective patriotism and civic culture. So I suggest that this approach will require some academic skepticism about our prevailing academic skepticism, our predominant rationalism, secularism, and skepticism regarding anything that's traditional, ideas or institutions or norms. So I'll close. I want to leave some time for questions. I think we should avoid the extremes of despair at the moment or a naive optimism that says, oh, it's likely to get better soon. There are some glimmers of hope about restoring a higher civics that blends liberal arts education with rational appreciation of America. As Professor Gish mentioned, I happen to have been at the start of what has become a national movement. So what began at Arizona State University is now, it depends on how you count, it's now in 12 states total, 17 public university campuses that have some kind of a center or department, or even in 2 of them, a college for civic thought and leadership. And I'll finish with a little prop. I've shown this to some of the faculty. Kinds of things that these separate units, departments of civic thought and leadership can do is have your own pocket constitution. But you're in a higher education institution, so it should be a Socratic pocket constitution. So we have the Declaration of Independence, we have the Constitution with all the amendments, all 27, and then we add a few other things. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, 1863, calling for a new birth of freedom on the premise of the Declaration. And 1963, Martin Luther King, Jr., the I Have a Dream Address, which praises the architects of our republic and the magnificent words of the Declaration of the Constitution, while demanding that we live up to those principles. So you could add other documents and ideals, Socratic higher civics. With that, I'm honored to be here. I'd be glad to take your questions. There are other glimmers of hope I could mention, but in the spirit of a reflective patriotism, I'm glad to have your questions and even your challenges and your disagreements. Floor's open. I did see a hand first way in the back, so yeah.
Can you stand up and speak up?
I'm sorry, my name's Chris. I'm a student here. Do you believe civil virtues can be taught, or are they something that people have to come to on their own?
I have recourse to Aristotle, right? Civic virtue, like any virtue, a habit, a disposition, can be taught in a sense through study, but it has to be practiced. How does one become courageous? By practicing courage. How do you know what courage is? Well, it helps to have some study, some guidance at some level to give you some general targets to aim at with any of the civic virtues, and including these particular civic virtues. So some study, some thinking, and then some opportunity to practice. Is that helpful? Yeah.
I'm just curious why we should preserve this Constitution in particular. I mean, other democracies have decided over the course of their progression, France comes to mind, that their current political order is so, fraught with tension or decay that they need to rewrite their Constitution or create a new one altogether. So I'm curious, perhaps, why we shouldn't take a similar mindset or tact here.
Fair point. One question is to ask how it is that America became the most powerful, wealthy, prosperous, secure power, possibly in all of human history, but certainly among free Republican forms of government. Is there something worth studying, knowing about, and possibly preserving? And especially for a public institution, I would say, again, this should be a rebuttable presumption of undergraduate education. And that means, though, it's a part of the research culture and the larger culture of the university. So, and secondly, the freedom and security, right? Notice that no police stepped out and grabbed you and said, "What? What'd you just say, young man?" Right? The FBI, the secret police, whoever it is, right, didn't come grab you and say, "Oh, that's threatening the government, that's insurrection," or whatever. Now, if anything like that happens in American life, we immediately, not waving our pocket constitution, but we talk about the First Amendment and freedom of speech, or freedom to assemble, or freedom to petition the government, and freedom of press, and right. So one has to be sort of deficit spending that degree of civic liberty and even equal civil rights. Again, not perfectly achieved at the beginning of our constitutional order, declarational order, but expanded and improved across 230 years of constitutional argument, 250 years of declarational argument. So those are the kinds of thoughts I have about, and I do think that's basically what American higher education is doing. We're deficit spending. The civic culture, the civic knowledge that sustains this constitutional order that gives us this wonderful set of opportunities we have. Yes?
So my name is Karen, and I had a question about your emphasis on the university's place in rolling out, a curriculum of civic education. I think, that's a worthy cause for universities and for higher education to take up. But I also feel that at its inception, at the beginning, it's likely that only universities with the resources and the faculty and the bandwidth to do so will be able to afford this kind of curriculum for their students. So I'd wonder if you would agree with that statement and how you anticipate we can make this rollout more equitable.
I was mentioning to faculty talking earlier a reality of American higher education. So I did mention the reality of declining confidence in, declining public legitimacy of higher education as a whole. And a further data point is this. Those of you in the room were born, but you were quite young when this happened. In 2008, a financial crisis happens. And after that, all around the country, state legislatures and governors had, as an emergency measure, a need to cut funding to public universities, but it never rebounded as a percentage of a budget authority for the entire budget of a public university. And I think that's related to the loss of public confidence in higher education. Now, the colleague that both Professor Gish and I mentioned at Harvard, Danielle Allen, wrote a piece in The Atlantic in April. You can find it. I'm pretty sure the title is "America and Its Universities Need a New Social Contract." And she's responding to the attacks from the Trump administration on higher education. Here she is at Harvard. And she's diplomatically, quietly admitting, just because it comes from President Trump doesn't mean everything he says is wrong. And one thing that his administrative team is pointing out is that higher education is overwhelmingly skewed intellectually, academically toward the left, and doesn't provide an adequate citizenship, civic education. And she's got bona fides because she's been writing about this for decades, right? So she's been talking about this. The new social contract would be to say the public, federal, and it could go to state and local, should invest in higher education, not only because of the great STEM research, including health, which benefits in all kinds of ways, and emphasis on economic development and preparation for careers. Danielle's argument is higher education should recommit to citizenship education, which, done properly, would be more intellectually, philosophically balanced than many studies in humanities and social sciences now. And so that's the enlightened part. We should be doing this. It would be good to have more intellectual heterogeneity and heterodoxy and debate within university curriculum and research. That's the enlightened part. The self-interested part is it would show the public that higher education is not an ideological project. It does care about citizen formation, the citizenry, civic health, civic order in these fundamental ways, in an intellectually balanced way. So the long game is to broaden the sources of support, renew the sources of support for higher education by showing we realize we do have a civic mission in this Socratic, intellectually balanced way. Sure, the two in the front row. So go ahead. I have friends, let's say, from the liberal education world who regularly discuss this with me. They were very worried that you can't fit together a genuine liberal arts education, questioning, Socratic in spirit, with an American civic education. There's a tension there that goes deeper than tension, maybe contradiction. To which I respond, as I tried to address in the lecture, that because America is founded on ideals, and then I'll get to the second part, which having metaphysical dimension. It should be constitutive of a citizenship education in this kind of civic order to be prepared to think in more complicated ways and to debate and discuss in more complicated ways. So that helps to bring the two closer together. Then if you look at the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson's draft has only one reference to some sort of a divinity. It's the opening paragraph, the laws of nature and nature's God. That's there. There's a sort of a second one, actually sort of a third one. In his draft, in the second paragraph, we are created equal natural rights, right? That language. But not a capital C creator. So Congress adds endowed by their capital C creator with these unalienable rights, okay? Sort of a third sacred honor at the end. Sacred honor. Well, sacred, that suggests divine. Okay. But really, Jefferson's only got the one. Laws of nature and nature's God. Congress adds three references to a divinity that are quite active. Right? Creator, and then capital C creator, and then in the final paragraph, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. And then in the very last sentence, appealing to the protection of divine providence, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. So now the sacred has a different weight because there's just been an appeal to divine providence, protecting, and the supreme judge of the world as the judge of the justice of what we are arguing. There are metaphysical, philosophical, natural theological, at least, issues right there in the text of the Declaration of Independence if we took it seriously. Right? They took it seriously because there were people like George Washington would have been a signer, except the Continental Congress 11 months earlier had sent him out to be the first commander of the American forces, right? Death was already happening. Killing, right? Americans were killing other people and they were being killed. This was happening. The stakes were huge. And it goes on for another, 6 years of active fighting beyond this point. So they went to the deepest principles or the highest principles. That's what a liberal arts education should be about. So that's how it would fit. Just there, and then it goes on and on. From 1776, it goes on and on. So.
Well, let me close the session by thanking all of you for coming to the Constitution Day, Citizenship Day celebration. I would encourage you to come up and ask questions of Dr. Carrese. We also have plenty of food. Please get some food. Also, I would encourage you to find one of the Lyceum Fellows and ask what they're working on, because they're doing research projects on the Declaration, on the U.S. Constitution, on the Texas Constitution. And finally, I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to stick around at 3 o'clock in the fishbowl down the hall. We're going to be talking with Dr. Carrese about George Washington's views on civic education and constitutional order. Finally, join me in thanking Dr. Carrese.